Caleb Whitmore never expected a child to shatter the armor he had spent decades building. It happened in Manhattan, on a Tuesday morning, when the air smelled of roasted coffee and taxi exhaust, and Wall Street traders barked into phones like their words could bend the world. Caleb was a name spoken in boardrooms and printed in glossy magazines, a billionaire CEO whose life was measured in quarterly reports, stock prices, and the number of zeros in his bank account. For him, emotions were distractions, and people were statistics. That morning, he thought it would be the same as every other, until he saw her. But before we get there, picture this. A child's fist clenched tight against a battered lunchbox, her voice trembling yet unyielding. "I can work," she said, her words as sharp as they were fragile. The faded lunchbox rattled as she opened it, revealing not sandwiches, not fruit, but a single crumpled note. "I'm sorry there's no food today. I'll try again tomorrow. Love, Mom." The billionaire who once believed money could solve everything now stood in tears, realizing the real hunger was not in her lunchbox, but in his own heart. Thank you for sticking around with me. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Across the room, a man worth billions froze. No one had ever spoken to him that way, least of all a child. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted, though neither of them knew just how much. Now, let's step back to that morning. Caleb's driver had pulled up to Central Park, the gleaming black car sliding to the curb with military precision. He liked to walk the last stretch to his office tower on Fifth Avenue. It gave him the illusion that he was still connected to the city he ruled. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, every button polished, every detail precise, he cut to the park like a blade. His mind buzzed with thoughts of mergers, acquisitions, and the two hostile investors waiting in his office. His phone vibrated endlessly in his pocket, but he ignored it. To him, nothing outside of business ever demanded urgency. But the city that morning was different. Runners jogged past with headphones bouncing. Nannies pushed strollers while chatting in Spanish. An old saxophonist played a tune that seemed far too soulful for such a busy hour. Caleb saw none of it. He had trained himself to tune out the world, to treat the noise as background to his private symphony of profit. And then he slowed. On a weather-beaten bench just a few steps off the main path sat a little girl, no older than 8. She wore a school uniform that had seen better days. The navy sweater was faded, the collar frayed. Her shoes, scuffed and nearly worn toward the toes, dangled above the ground as if they'd long outgrown her feet. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was simply sitting, hands wrapped tightly around a lunchbox. It was pink once, though the years had dulled it to a pale, washed-out rose. Stickers clung to its surface in fragments. Half of a unicorn here, a chipped rainbow there. She held it close as if it contained treasure. Caleb stopped walking. He couldn't explain why his feet disobeyed him. For a man who thrived on schedules down to the second, stopping in the middle of his morning walk was unthinkable. Yet his eyes locked on that lunchbox, and his chest felt heavy in a way he couldn't name. The girl lifted the box onto her lap, her small fingers tracing the scratches across its surface. For a moment, she just stared at it, as though gathering courage. Then, with the slow reverence of someone opening a sacred chest, she unlatched it. Caleb leaned forward slightly. Inside there was nothing. No sandwich wrapped in foil. No apple rolling to the corner. No crumbs at all. The lunchbox was completely empty. But the girl's expression wasn't one of shame. She didn't flinch. She didn't try to hide it. Instead, she reached inside and carefully unfolded a piece of paper. The wind tugged at its edges, threatening to pull it away, but she held firm. Her lips moved silently as she read the note, and though Caleb was too far to hear the words, he saw the way her face softened, as though the emptiness didn't matter. Something twisted deep in his stomach. He thought of his own mornings. of chefs preparing elaborate breakfasts he rarely touched, of assistants waiting with protein shakes and artisan coffees. He thought of the glass dining table in his penthouse where he ate alone day after day, and how even in the abundance he often felt hollow. But here was a girl with nothing in her box, and yet she looked at that note as though it filled her more than any meal could. For reasons he couldn't explain, Caleb's throat grew tight. He cleared it, shook his head, and tried to walk on, but his feet wouldn't obey. His mind, usually razor-sharp and ruthless, felt clouded, unfocused. Why was he staring at a child on a bench when billions of dollars hung in the balance of his next meeting? Why did that empty box seem heavier than any deal he had ever signed? The city carried on around him, horns blaring, joggers weaving through paths, the saxophone's mournful tune spilling across the park. Yet in that moment, Caleb Whitmore stood still, pinned in place by a little girl's lunchbox. And though he didn't know it yet, that pause, the first in years, was a crack through which an entirely new life was about to enter. He would later remember the way the morning sun hit the metal clasp of the box, the way her small fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded that paper, the way she sat with dignity even in lack. These details would replay in his mind long after that day, haunting him, reshaping him. But in that moment, all he could do was stand and stare, unable to turn away, unable to move forward. For Caleb Whitmore, the billionaire CEO who thought numbers defined success, time had stopped, and everything he believed about wealth, about power, about life itself, was about to be tested by a little girl on a park bench with nothing but an empty lunchbox and a note that held more weight than gold.
Caleb Whitmore had negotiated billion-dollar mergers with the calm precision of a surgeon. He had stared down boardroom rivals who were old enough to be his father, reducing them to silence with a single glance. He had made presidents, athletes, and celebrities wait for his time, and he never flinched. But now, standing only a few feet from a park bench in Central Park, he found himself holding his breath, caught in the fragile anticipation of a little girl opening her lunchbox. She cradled it in her lap with both hands, her small thumbs grazing the worn edges, as if smoothing the scars of years gone by. Caleb noticed how deliberate her movements were, not rushed, not clumsy, but steady, almost ceremonial. It reminded him of how monks in faraway temples might lift a relic, or how an art collector would unwrap a priceless painting. For her, this was not just a box. This was something sacred. The park's chaos seemed to fade, the joggers, the horns, even the saxophone that had been wailing nearby. Caleb's world narrowed to the faded pink lunchbox and the girl who held it with reverence. He leaned forward slightly, curiosity gnawing at him. He expected the ordinary, a sandwich wrapped in plastic, maybe a piece of fruit, perhaps even some leftover pasta. Children always carried food in boxes like these. That was the rule. That was the expectation. The latch clicked open. Caleb's chest tightened as the lid creaked upward, like the slow rise of a curtain before the first act of a play. He braced himself, though he didn't know why. But when the inside was revealed, the anticipation collapsed into silence. It was empty, not almost empty, not just a crumb or two left. It was hollow, a bare shell of plastic, a pink vessel with nothing inside but air. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He had expected so much from something so ordinary, and yet he was met with nothingness. For a man who had built an empire around numbers, projections, and tangible returns, this discovery struck him like a blow. It wasn't just the absence of food. It was a stark contrast between what should have been there and what wasn't. He thought of the chefs in his penthouse kitchen, of the tables groaning under platters at his galas, of the untouched meals whisked away by staff when he grew tired of them. He thought of the fridge stocked with delicacies from 3 continents, the daily shipment of fresh produce flown in from California, France, and beyond. And here, just blocks away from his office tower, a child sat with a lunchbox as hollow as an echo. But what unsettled him most wasn't the emptiness. It was her face. The girl did not flinch. She didn't glance around to see if anyone had noticed. She didn't shut the box quickly to hide her shame. Instead, she gazed into the void with a calmness that unnerved him. And then she smiled. It wasn't the careless grin of a child unaware of hardship. It wasn't the forced smile of someone pretending things were fine. It was something deeper, a quiet, knowing smile, as if the emptiness itself carried meaning only she could decipher. Caleb's jaw tightened. His instinct was to interpret, to analyze, to solve. That was what he did. He solved problems with money, with strategy, with force of will. But this was different. How could a girl smile at nothing? How could she hold an empty box with such grace, as though the lack itself was a gift? His chest constricted in a way he hadn't felt in years. Not the sharp pinch of stress from a failing investment, not the shallow anxiety of public appearances. No, this was something else entirely, something dangerously close to emotion. The girl reached into the box, her fingers brushing its bare surface as though feeling for something invisible. Caleb almost leaned forward, half expecting her to pull out a treasure hidden in the emptiness. But she didn't. She simply rested her hand inside, as though acknowledging that the box was exactly what it was. Empty, and yet she looked content. Caleb couldn't remember the last time he had looked content, even with everything he possessed. His mornings began with reports. His nights ended with emails. His life was full, yet hollow. Hers was hollow, yet somehow full. The irony stung him like a blade. He tried to look away, but his gaze refused to obey. His mind screamed at him, "This is none of your business. You're wasting time. She's just a child. You have an empire to run." But his heart, a muscle he had long ignored, pulled him back toward the little girl with the empty box. For the first time in decades, Caleb Whitmore wondered, not about stocks, not about profits, not about acquisitions, but about life itself. How could someone so small, so lacking in everything he believed essential, carry herself with more peace than he had ever known? It was as if she held a secret the world had kept from him, a truth hidden in plain sight, written not in numbers but in silence, in absence, in the quiet dignity of a child in her empty lunchbox. Caleb inhaled sharply. The air felt heavier now, each breath a reminder of his own hunger, the hunger he had never named, the hunger for meaning, for something he could not buy. And in that moment, as the city surged around him, as time refused to pause for anyone but seemed to bend around her, Caleb Whitmore realized something terrifying. The child with nothing might actually be richer than the man who had everything. Caleb Whitmore thought he had prepared himself. He had already seen the emptiness, the stark plastic of the pink lunchbox, the hollow that echoed louder than any noise in Central Park that morning. But what happened next shook him away he hadn't felt in decades. The little girl's hands, small but steady, reached back inside the barren box. Caleb almost scoffed inwardly. What more could she possibly take from emptiness? Yet her fingers closed around something thin, something delicate, and she drew out slowly, as if afraid the air itself might tear it away. It was a folded piece of paper. Caleb's curiosity deepened. He recognized the way she held it, like it wasn't just paper, but something rare, fragile, precious. She didn't unfold it quickly, like a child eager to finish homework or scribble another drawing. No, she opened the way one might unseal a letter from a long-lost loved one, savoring each crease, guarding its contents with reverence. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, not because she was careless, but because she was small and the weight of meaning was heavy. Then he saw the handwriting. Uneven, slightly tilted letters, drawn with the innocent sincerity of a child. Across the page were words that seemed to pulse with life. "This lunchbox may be empty, but my heart is full. Mama says love feeds the soul more than bread ever can." Caleb felt the words before he fully processed them. They crashed through his chest like a wave-breaking stone. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, his vision blurred. The girl's lips moved softly, repeating the words aloud, her voice no louder than the wind brushing through the trees. She whispered them like a prayer, like an anthem she had carried in her bones. Caleb's hands twitched at his sides. He felt ridiculous, standing in his $1,000 shoes, his tie knotted to perfection, his phone buzzing with messages that would decide the fate of companies. And yet here he was, undone by a child reading a note. He blinked hard, trying to clear his eyes, but the blur remained. He hadn't cried in years. He couldn't remember the last time he allowed himself that weakness, if he ever had. But now, no amount of discipline or control could stop it. The tears hovered stubbornly, threatening to betray the fortress he had built. And with them came memory. Unwelcome, uninvited, raw. He remembered his own childhood. The grand estates, the marble floors, the meals laid out like feasts for kings. Plates piled high with delicacies. Courses prepared by chefs who spoke in accents he could barely understand. He had never known an empty lunchbox, not once in his life. Yet the memory cut deeper than hunger, because though his plate was always full, his home had always been empty. His mother's notes. Yes, she had left them sometimes, but they were reminders of piano practice, of tutors, of expectations. Notes that scolded in elegant script. Don't forget your Latin lesson. Your handwriting must improve. Discipline is everything, Caleb. Never once did they say, I love you. Never once did they feed his soul. He had grown up surrounded by wealth, but starved of warmth. The chandeliers sparkled. The suits fit perfectly. The parties were lavish. But his father's affection was measured in quarterly profits, and his mother's gaze was colder than the silver cutlery on their dining table. And now, here he was, staring at a girl who had nothing. No food, no wealth, no privilege. Yet in her hands, she held a note that carried more love than he had known in his entire childhood. Caleb swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat refused to move. His heart, which he had silenced for decades under layers of ambition and numbers, now roared to life, pounding against his ribs. For the first time in his life, Caleb Whitmore envied a child. He envied her empty lunchbox, because inside it was something he had never owned, a treasure no money could buy. He envied the way she smiled as she read the note, a smile born not from abundance, but from a love so pure it nourished her even in hunger. He envied the richness of her emptiness. The girl folded the paper back up with care, as though returning it to a vault. She placed it in the lunchbox, shut the lid softly, and held it against her chest. And with that simple gesture, she looked more complete than Caleb had ever felt. His mind screamed at him to move, to walk away, to bury this moment under spreadsheets and deals. But his heart, rebellious, newly awakened, clung to the sight of her. He knew instinctively that this moment was not just another passing scene. This was a fracture in his story, a break in the script he had written for himself. The billionaire CEO who thought success was measured in numbers had been undone by a note written in a child's uneven hand. And though he stood rooted in Central Park, with the city roaring around him, he was no longer in Manhattan. He was in two worlds at once. One where he had everything and felt nothing, and another where a child had nothing and yet felt everything. The contrast carved through him like lightning. For the first time, Caleb Whitmore no longer wanted to be himself. He wanted to trade it all, his towers, his fortune, his influence, for that one note, for the love behind it, for the fullness it promised. But he couldn't. He could only stand there, helpless, a man brought to his knees not by rivals, not by markets, not by failure, but by a little girl's empty lunchbox and the words inside it. For a long moment, Caleb Whitmore stood frozen, watching the girl cradle her empty lunchbox like a treasure chest. The folded note had been returned inside, sealed away with the kind of care he had only ever seen when bankers locked away jewels. He should have turned away. He had no business here. But something stronger than logic pulled at him, an invisible force that tugged him closer to the child on the worn bench. His polished shoes crunched softly against the gravel path as he approached. Each step felt foreign, almost reckless, as if he were trespassing into a world he had never been invited to enter. The girl looked up, her dark eyes bright against the morning light, and then she smiled. It was not a smile of politeness, nor one of expectation. It was open, unguarded, and startlingly warm. For a man who lived behind glass walls and iron schedules, that smile pierced straight through him. It melted the invisible steel he had built around his soul, brick by careful brick, over decades. He hadn't realized how heavy that wall was until he felt the first crack split wide. "Good morning," Caleb said, his voice softer than he intended. It felt strange to hear himself speak without authority, without command. "Hi," the girl answered, swinging her feet slightly, as though speaking to a billionaire CEO in the middle of Central Park was the most natural thing in the world. He hesitated, his throat dry. Then, carefully, he asked, "Why do you carry an empty lunchbox?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the skyscrapers looming in the distance. He worried suddenly that it sounded cruel, but the girl didn't frown. She didn't shy away. Instead, her smile remained steady and disarming. "My mama doesn't always have food for me," she said simply, as if stating the weather. "But she still packs my lunchbox every morning." Caleb frowned, puzzled. "But if there's no food, why pack it at all?" She looked down at the box and ran her small hand across its scratched surface. "Because it makes me feel like everyone else at school," she whispered. "The other kids don't notice when it's empty. They just see me carrying it, like them, and inside I keep Mama's notes." Her fingers tapped gently against the lid. "She writes them every morning. She says they'll give me strength." Caleb's chest tightened. Notes? In his world, notes were numbers scribbled in margins, signatures on contracts, clauses tucked into agreements. Notes meant leverage, risk, profit. But here, to this child, notes meant strength. Real strength. "What do they say?" he asked, his voice almost breaking. The girl opened the box again, careful and deliberate. She pulled out the folded paper, as though unveiling a relic. "Different things every day," she explained. "Sometimes it's, 'I love you.' Sometimes it's, 'Don't give up.' Sometimes it's just a smiley face. But Mama says words can fill your stomach if your heart listens closely enough." Her words pierced him. Caleb felt something in his throat close off, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He turned his gaze away, staring at the trees swaying in the park, trying to regain control. Strength. The word echoed in his mind like a challenge. In his world, strength had always been power, outmaneuvering competitors, cutting deals that made headlines, standing unflinching in boardrooms where men twice his age tried to break him. Strength meant having the upper hand, dictating terms, forcing outcomes. But this child, with her worn shoes and her empty box, spoke of strength as if it were something different, something quieter, something deeper. He swallowed hard, finally managing to ask, "And does it work? Do the notes give you strength?" She looked at him, her eyes as clear as glass. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Because when Mama writes them, I know she believes in me. And when someone believes in you, it's easier to believe in yourself." Caleb felt a sharp ache in his chest, the kind of ache he had smothered for years with luxury and noise. Memory stabbed at him again. His mother's notes filled with instructions, his father's cold nods of approval only when goals were met. No one had ever written him a note to say, "I believe in you." No one had ever reminded him he was loved. And yet here was a child who had nothing, teaching him the one truth he had spent his entire life overlooking. He blinked rapidly, forcing back the sting in his eyes. He could not cry, not here, not now. But the pressure was immense, and his heart thudded like a drum inside his chest. "I think your mama is very wise," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl grinned, clutching the note to her chest. "She is. She says food fills your belly, but love fills your life." Caleb lowered himself on the bench beside her, feeling strangely small despite his towering presence in the corporate world. For the first time in his memory, he was not the teacher, not the commander, not the man in charge. He was a student, and his teacher was a little girl with nothing but an empty lunchbox and a mother's words tucked inside. The park hummed around them, joggers passing, taxis honking the distance, pigeons flapping overhead, but Caleb heard none of it. All he heard was the sound of truth unraveling the lies he had built his life upon. Strength wasn't power. It wasn't control. It wasn't measured in numbers. It lived in love, in notes scrawled on scraps of paper, in the quiet faith of a hungry heart. And sitting there, beside the little girl who carried everything he lacked, Caleb Whitmore realized his empire had been built on sand. Caleb Whitmore had lived his life with walls. Thick, invisible walls that kept pain out and power in. He had built them so carefully over the years that not even he noticed them anymore. To his rivals, he was unshakable. To his employees, untouchable. To himself, invulnerable. But the girl's words, simple, gentle, unpolished, slipped through cracks in those walls like sunlight sneaking past a curtain. She says food fills your belly, but love fills your life. Something shifted inside him, not loud, not sudden, but deep, like the quiet creak of a door long rusted shut finally beginning to open. And in that moment, the past he had buried came rushing back. He saw himself again, not as the billionaire CEO who commanded skyscrapers, but as a boy of 8, just like the girl before him. The memory unfolded with such vivid clarity that it stole his breath. There he was, sitting in the back seat of his father's polished town car, clutching a gleaming new lunchbox. It was silver, not pink, embossed with initials, so the world would know it belonged to a Whitmore. His mother had placed a note inside, carefully folded. Young Caleb had unwrapped it eagerly, thinking it would be something warm, something gentle. But it hadn't been. Don't forget piano at 4 o'clock. Scales before sonatas. Precision before passion. Another day, another note. Your penmanship is slipping. Excellence is in the details. And another, you must place first in the competition. Whitmores do not come second. Never once. I love you. Never once. I'm proud of you. The boy in those memories had been fed well. Meals of steak and caviar, desserts plated with gold dust, fruits flown in from countries he couldn't pronounce. His stomach had never known hunger, but his heart had been hollow, aching for a tenderness that never arrived. The weight of it slammed into him now, decades later, as he sat beside a little girl whose empty lunchbox carried more nourishment than his ever had. His vision blurred again. His chest heaved. And then tears. They came silently, traitorous rivers carving down his cheeks. He tried to swallow them back, to command himself the way he commanded a room, but the dam had broken. The tears slipped free, unstoppable, soaking the edges of his carefully pressed collar. Embarrassment struck him instantly. Billionaires did not cry in public. CEOs did not crumble on park benches. Vulnerability was a weakness he had been trained to despise. He turned his head sharply, hoping to shield his face, hoping the girl would not notice. But of course she did. She noticed everything. And instead of laughing, instead of recoiling, instead of shrinking into discomfort, she smiled. That same smile, unguarded, knowing, patient. "It's okay," she whispered. Her voice softened the breeze that rustled the trees above them. Caleb forced himself to glance at her. She was still holding the folded note in her small hands, the corners creased from years of use. Her gaze was steady calm, far too wise for her age. Mama says even strong people need to cry sometimes. The words hit him harder than any business defeat, sharper than any betrayal he had faced in boardrooms. Strong people. Crying. He had spent his whole life proving strength by never letting anyone see him break, by burying his pain under titles, acquisitions, and walls of glass and steel. And yet here was his child, redefining strength with the gentleness of a whisper. Tears continued to fall, unrelenting. He let out a shaky breath, lowering his head into his hand for a moment. He hated how small he felt, how helpless, how exposed. But deep down, under the shame, there was something else, a strange, unfamiliar relief, as if the tears were not betrayal, but release. He thought again of his mother's notes, cold and clipped. They had been instructions, demands, corrections. each one a reminder that he was never enough, that excellence was duty, not choice. He had lived his entire life chasing her approval, but approval was not love. And without love, those notes were hollow, just as hollow as his wealth felt now. Yet this girl, with nothing but scraps of paper, had more than he ever had. Her notes weren't perfect. The handwriting was uneven, the ink sometimes smudged, but they carried something priceless. Love, belief, warmth, the very things he had starved for all his life. The empty lunchbox beside her became a mirror, reflecting everything he had missed. Not food, not comfort, but tenderness. He lifted his head slowly, still blinking through tears. The girl had turned slightly toward him, her smile unwavering, her eyes kind. She didn't flinch at his weakness, didn't judge him for it. Instead, her presence told him something he had never heard, something his own parents had never given him. You're allowed to feel. And in that permission, Caleb felt something shift within him. The boy he once was stirred awake inside, reaching out from the shadows of marble halls and gilded cages. For years, that boy had been silenced, ordered into obedience, hardened into stone. But now, sitting beside this child on a worn park bench, that boy was remembered. Caleb let the tears fall freely. He no longer tried to choke them back. The city moved around them, indifferent and hurried. But for him time had slowed, tethered to this single fragile moment. The billionaire who had conquered skyscrapers and silenced rivals now sat quietly, undone by a little girl's wisdom. And for the first time in his life, he realized that perhaps strength wasn't in holding back tears, but in letting them fall. Caleb Whitmore was a man who had spent his life believing every problem could be solved with money. A factory strike, raise the wages. A merger falling apart, sweeten the deal. A politician reluctant to play along, fund the next campaign. He had grown addicted to the certainty of it. Money as hammer, money as scalpel, money as a cure to every ailment that stood in his way. But here, on a worn wooden bench in Central Park, with pigeons pecking at crumbs near his shoes, that illusion crumbled. In front of him sat a little girl who had no food in her lunchbox, no security in her life, and yet carried herself with a quiet resilience that he could neither buy nor explain. She was not begging him for help. She was not asking for favors. She was simply existing in her truth, and somehow that made him, Caleb Whitmore, billionaire, empire builder, titan of industry, feel powerless. And for the first time in decades, he didn't feel ashamed of that powerlessness. He felt human. He sat down beside her, lowering himself onto the bench as if stepping into another world. His suit creased against the rough wood. His watch gleamed under the sunlight, but none of those details mattered. For once, he was not Caleb the CEO, not the man people whisper about in skyscraper elevators. He was simply a man beside a child, humbled by her strength. "What do you dream about?" he asked, his voice cautious, like someone speaking a language he hadn't used in years. The girl tilted her head, studying him as if deciding whether he deserved the answer. Then her lips curved into a soft smile. "I want to be a teacher," she said. The simplicity of it caught him off guard. He had expected something else, a ballerina, a singer, perhaps even a lawyer or a doctor. But teacher? The word was small, yet carried a weight he didn't understand. "Why a teacher?" he pressed gently. Her hands tightened around the lunchbox, her eyes bright with conviction. "Because teachers give kids what my mama gives me. Hope, even when things are empty." Caleb blinked. The word struck him harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. Hope. It was such a fragile thing, yet the way she spoke of it made it sound sturdier than steel. She continued, her voice steady but soft. "When you're a kid, sometimes the world feels too big. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't care if you disappear. But teachers, they notice you. They tell you that you matter. My mama notices me too, with her notes. That's why I want to be like her. I want to remind other kids that even if their box is empty, their heart doesn't have to be." Caleb felt his chest tighten, his throat closing as if the air itself resisted him. He had sat in rooms where fortunes were decided, where men rose and fell by the weight of their ambitions, but he had never heard words that landed with such force. For years, he had measured value by numbers in an account, by the rise and fall of markets, by the size of the towers he built. Yet here was a child, with nothing but a scrap of paper and a dream, speaking of value in terms of hope, dignity, and love. Her words were heavier than the millions in his bank account, and what astonished him was how eagerly he received them. Normally, when people spoke, Caleb's mind was already calculating how to respond, how to win, how to use the information. But now, for once, he wasn't planning his next move. He wasn't thinking about his phone buzzing in his pocket or the investors waiting in his office. He wasn't wondering if this conversation could be monetized or leveraged. He simply wanted to listen. The city carried on around them, dogs barking, car horns blaring, joggers panting as they ran past, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was his small voice, filled with conviction, telling him a truth that shattered his carefully constructed world. Caleb thought about his silver trays, the ones polished so clean they reflected the chandelier light like mirrors. Meals prepared with precision, brought to him by silent staff who never made eye contact. Food so abundant that waste was inevitable, yet tasteless in its perfection. He thought of how many times he had pushed away plates without a second glance, dismissing them as though nourishment were an afterthought. And then he looked at her empty lunchbox, a box with no food, no silver, no luxury, and yet in her hands, it carried more value than every plated dish he had consumed in his lifetime, because her box carried meaning. It carried strength. It carried love. It was not filled with bread, but was filled with hope, and suddenly Caleb realized that was the nourishment he had been starving for his entire life. He turned his head to look at her, really look at her, as if she were not a stranger but a mirror. "You're very brave," he said quietly. The girl giggled, shaking her head. "I'm not brave. Mama's brave. I just believe her." Her innocence, her humility, cut deeper than arrogance ever could. Caleb leaned back against the bench, closed his eyes for a brief moment. For once, he did not feel the weight of expectation pressing against him. He did not feel the endless race of ambition clawing at his heels. All he felt was stillness, and a fullness he could not explain. It startled him, this discovery, that peace could come not from abundance, but from emptiness, that the greatest gift was not what filled the body, but what lifted the spirit. That perspective itself could nourish. And sitting there, with a little girl who dreamed of becoming a teacher, Caleb Whitmore realized he was learning for the first time in years. The teacher he had never asked for had arrived, and she was 8 years old, with worn shoes, a smile brighter than morning light, and an empty lunchbox that contained the richest meal he had ever received. The sun had risen higher now, washing Central Park in golden light that danced across the leaves. Morning joggers passed with steady rhythm. Parents pushed strollers, and pigeons scattered as children chased them across the paths. Life continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for Caleb Whitmore, the world would never look the same again. He sat still on the bench, his polished shoes planted on the gravel, his suit jacket wrinkled against the wooden slats. For once, he didn't care about appearances. He didn't care if anyone recognized him, didn't care about the headlines or the whispers of strangers. His gaze was locked on the small, delicate hands of the little girl beside him, the hands that clutched a scrap of paper as though it were the most valuable possession in the universe. That note, it had been written in shaky handwriting, filled with the quiet courage of a mother who had nothing material to give but everything of herself to offer. He had read contracts worth billions, agreements that stretched for hundreds of pages, but never had he seen words with such power. "This lunchbox may be empty, but my heart is full." The line echoed inside him, each word pressing deeper, cracking the stone that had encased his spirit for decades. He had once believed emptiness was failure, a deal that collapsed, an account that drained, a project that never launched. These were the shadows he had spent his life outrunning. Yet here, In the trembling hands of the child, emptiness had revealed itself as something else entirely. Not failure, not defeat, but love. Her empty lunchbox was not a symbol of poverty. It was a vessel of resilience, of creativity, of lessons he had been too blind to see. And suddenly, he could no longer hold it back. The first tear slipped down his cheek, startling him with its warmth. Then another followed, and another, until his vision blurred and the world softened around him. He had cried only once as an adult, when his father died, and even then his tears had been born more of duty than grief. But these tears were different. They carried no shame, no restraint. They were not for her, not for her hunger or her hardships. They were for himself. For the man who had spent decades dining from silver trays while starving for meaning. For the boy inside him who had once craved notes of love, but had instead been handed ledgers and expectations. For the emptiness he had tried to fill with skyscrapers and stock markets, never realizing the fullness he sought could not be purchased. He turned to her, his voice trembling, and whispered, "Thank you." The girl tilted her head, puzzled by the weight in his tone. "For what?" "For teaching me," he said, his throat tightening. "For showing me what it really means to be rich." She giggled softly, as if she couldn't imagine teaching a man in a suit anything at all. But Caleb knew the truth. She had given him more in this hour than he had ever gained from years of chasing power. He leaned closer, his voice gentle but steady. "You told me you want to be a teacher one day." She nodded, her eyes glowing with quiet pride. "Your dream," he said, "will never remain just a dream. I promise you that." He didn't know yet how he would fulfill it, whether through scholarships, foundations, or something even greater. But he knew with absolute certainty that he would. For once, his money would not be a weapon or shield. It would be a bridge, a tool to lift rather than to conquer. The little girl smiled, her hands pressing the note against her chest as though it had just grown even more powerful. Caleb inhaled deeply, the morning air sharper and clearer than he remembered. As he stood, he felt the strangest sensation. His suit, usually heavy with expectation, seemed lighter. His watch no longer felt like chains on his wrist. His shoes no longer clicked with arrogance. Each part of him felt reshaped, stripped of its armor. His steps were slower as he began to walk away. Yet each carried more weight, more meaning, than all the hurried strides he had ever taken toward boardrooms and bank vaults. He didn't glance at his phone. He didn't check his schedule. The world could wait. For the first time in his life, Caleb Whitmore felt rich. Not because of the billions spread across accounts. Not because of the towers his name adorned. Not because of the endless power he wielded in rooms filled with men who feared him. But because of a little girl with faded lunchbox who carried emptiness with more dignity than he had ever carried abundance. His heart was heavier now, but not with the weight of greed. It was heavy with meaning, with love, with a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. And as the sun climbed higher above Manhattan, spilling its light across the park, Caleb realized the greatest fortune he had ever received was not measured in dollars. It was measured in tears, tears that had transformed him, drop by drop, into something he had long forgotten he could be. Human, thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.